In 1892, this formal studio portrait was taken in downtown Fall River, Massachusetts. At first glance, it shows a respectable 32-year-old woman from a prominent family dressed in the finest Victorian attire. Her hair is perfectly arranged, her posture dignified, her expression calm and composed. She appears to be everything that polite society expected of an unmarried woman from a wealthy household. But this photograph captures Lizzie Andrew Borden just months before she would become the most notorious woman in America. Behind that serene expression and proper Victorian facade lay secrets that would shock the nation and create a mystery that remains unsolved over 130 years later. Lizzie was born on July 19, 1860, into what appeared to be an ideal New England family. Her father, Andrew Jackson Borden, was one of Fall River's wealthiest men, having built a fortune through banking, real estate, and textile manufacturing. The Bordens lived in a substantial house on 2nd Street, in the heart of the city's most respectable neighborhood. However, Lizzie's early years were marked by profound loss. Her mother, Sarah Morse Borden, died when Lizzie was just 2 years old, leaving her and her older sister Emma to be raised by their grieving father. Andrew Borden, a stern man focused on business and accumulating wealth, struggled to provide the emotional warmth that two young girls desperately needed. 3 years after Sarah's death, Andrew married Abby Durfee Gray, a woman from a modest background who was 37 years old and had never been married. The marriage was practical rather than romantic. Andrew needed someone to manage his household and care for his daughters, while Abby needed financial security. From the beginning, Lizzie and Emma viewed their stepmother with suspicion and resentment. They never called her mother, instead referring to her coldly as Mrs. Borden. This formal distance would define the household dynamics for the next 27 years, creating tensions that would ultimately contribute to one of America's most infamous crimes. The portrait shows none of this family discord, presenting instead the image of a proper Victorian lady who would never harm anyone. As Lizzie grew from child to young woman, the Borden household became increasingly divided along invisible but unmistakable lines. The large house on 2nd Street, which should have been filled with warmth and family unity, instead harbored growing resentments and unspoken conflicts that would shape Lizzie's entire personality. Andrew Borden's approach to parenting reflected his business mindset: practical, efficient, and emotionally distant. He provided well for his daughters' material needs, ensuring they had proper clothing, education, and social opportunities befitting their station. However, he showed little interest in their emotional development or personal happiness. His relationship with his wife Abby was similarly businesslike, lacking the affection that might have created a more harmonious home. Environment: Lizzie and Emma found themselves caught between their loyalty to their deceased mothers, memory, and their father's expectations that they accept Abby as part of the family. Emma, 9 years older than Lizzie, often served as a protective buffer, but this also meant that Lizzie developed a fierce independence and a stubborn streak that would characterize her throughout her life. The sisters attended Central Congregational Church regularly, where Lizzie became involved in various charitable activities and Sunday school teaching. This religious involvement was both genuine and strategic. It provided her with social connections outside the tense atmosphere of her home, while also establishing her reputation as a moral, upstanding member of the community. During her teenage years, Lizzie attended Fall River High School, where she proved to be an intelligent but unremarkable student. Her teachers remembered her as quiet and somewhat withdrawn, preferring to observe rather than participate actively in classroom discussions. She had few close friends, partly due to her family's wealth, which set her apart from many of her classmates, and partly due to her own reserved nature. By the time she reached adulthood, Lizzie had settled into a routine that revolved around church activities, charitable work, and managing the social expectations that came with being Andrew Borden's daughter. However, beneath this conventional exterior, tensions were building that would eventually explode in ways no one could have predicted. In the late 1880s, a seemingly minor family financial matter would plant the seeds of the tragedy that was to come. Andrew Borden had always been careful with money, but his treatment of financial matters involving his daughters and his wife would create resentments that festered for years. The first major incident occurred when Andrew decided to give Abby a house that had belonged to her family. To the outside world, this appeared to be a generous gesture from a husband to his wife. However, Lizzie and Emma viewed it as a betrayal. Their father was giving away property that they believed should remain within the Borden family bloodline. To appease his daughter's anger, Andrew gave them the family's old homestead and some rental property. While this gesture was intended to restore balance, it actually highlighted the growing divide in the household. The message was clear: Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and Emma were not truly one family, but rather competing interests held together by legal and social obligations. These inheritance disputes revealed deeper issues within the Borden household. Lizzie had always harbored hopes that she might inherit enough money to live independently, perhaps traveling to Europe or establishing her own household away from Fall River's restrictive social environment. The prospect of sharing her father's wealth with Abby threatened these dreams of freedom. Neighbors began to notice the tension within the Borden house. The family rarely appeared together in public, and when they did, the interactions between Lizzie, Emma, and Abby were notably cold and formal. Friends of the family later recalled that Lizzie would leave the room when Abby entered, and that meals were often eaten in uncomfortable silence. Andrew, perhaps recognizing the growing discord in his household, became even more withdrawn and focused on his business affairs. He spent increasing amounts of time at his office or visiting his rental properties, leaving the women of the house to navigate their complicated relationships without his intervention. By 1891, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Lizzie and Emma rarely spoke directly to their stepmother, communicating instead through their father, or the family's domestic helper, Bridget Sullivan. In the months leading up to August 1892, several incidents occurred that, in retrospect, should have served as warning signs of the tragedy to come. However, the rigid social conventions of Victorian society prevented anyone from recognizing the depth of the problems within the Borden household. The first significant incident happened in early 1892 when someone broke into the Borden family barn and stole several items, including some tools. Andrew Borden was convinced that the burglary was an inside job, and he began to suspect that someone in the household was responsible. This suspicion created an atmosphere of distrust that made an already tense situation even more uncomfortable. Around the same time, both Andrew and Abby became ill with what appeared to be food poisoning. They recovered quickly, but Abby confided to a neighbor that she suspected someone had deliberately poisoned their food. While no investigation was conducted, this incident added another layer of fear and suspicion to the household dynamics. Lizzie's behavior during this period also became more erratic. She was observed by neighbors having heated arguments with her father about money and her future prospects. At 32, Lizzie was considered a spinster by Victorian standards, and the social pressure of her unmarried status was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Friends and church associates noticed that Lizzie had become more withdrawn and irritable. She frequently complained about feeling trapped in Fall River and expressed desires to travel or live elsewhere. However, her father's tight control over the family finances made any independent action nearly impossible. The family's domestic helper, Bridget Sullivan, later testified that the atmosphere in the house had become almost unbearable. The women rarely spoke to each other except when absolutely necessary, and meals were consumed in uncomfortable silence. Bridget noted that she had considered leaving her position several times due to the tension, but needed the steady employment. Emma, perhaps sensing the dangerous level of tension in the house, had been spending increasing amounts of time visiting friends in other towns. In July 1892, she left for an extended visit to Fairhaven, leaving Lizzie alone to deal with the increasingly strained relationship between her father and stepmother. These warning signs, clearly visible to those around the family, went unaddressed, setting the stage for the shocking events that would unfold on a hot August morning. August 4th, 1892, dawned hot and humid in Fall River, Massachusetts. The oppressive heat that had settled over the city for several days showed no signs of breaking, and the Borden household began what appeared to be another routine day. However, by evening, this ordinary Thursday would become the most infamous day in Fall River's history. Andrew Borden had risen early, as was his custom, and left the house to attend to various business matters around the city. Abby Borden spent the morning doing household tasks and visiting with a friend who had stopped by. Lizzie claimed to be feeling unwell and remained in her room for much of the early morning hours. Bridget Sullivan, the family's Irish domestic worker, was busy with her regular cleaning duties, despite feeling ill herself. She had asked Andrew for permission to go outside for fresh air, as the heat inside the house was becoming unbearable. The atmosphere in the house that morning was described by Bridget as particularly tense, with even less conversation than usual between the family members. Around 9:30 in the morning, Andrew returned home briefly, then left again to conduct more business in the downtown area. Abby was upstairs in the guest bedroom, apparently making the bed or doing some cleaning. Lizzie was moving about the house, sometimes inside, sometimes stepping out to the barn or the backyard. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Andrew Borden returned home for the final time. He entered through the front door, which was unusual, as the family typically used the side entrance. Bridget helped him with the locks, as the door had been secured with multiple bolts, a recent precaution Andrew had implemented due to his concerns about security. Andrew settled into the sitting room for a rest, lying down on the sofa as he often did during hot afternoons. The house fell into its typical midday quiet, with only the sounds of Bridget's cleaning activities and the occasional movement from other parts of the house. What happened next would shock the nation and create a mystery that continues to fascinate people more than 130 years later. The events of the next hour would transform Lizzie Borden from an unremarkable spinster into the most notorious woman in America, and would ensure that the quiet house on 2nd Street would forever be associated with one of the most puzzling crimes in American history. At approximately 11:15 a.m. on August 4th, 1892, Lizzie Borden's cries for help shattered the oppressive quiet of the summer morning. "Bridget, come down quick," she called to the domestic worker, who was resting in her third-floor room. Someone has hurt Father. Bridget Sullivan rushed downstairs to find Lizzie standing near the sitting room, her face pale and her voice shaking. Inside the room, Andrew Borden lay motionless on the sofa where he had been resting. The scene that greeted Bridget was beyond comprehension. Andrew had suffered multiple severe wounds to his head and face, clearly from some kind of sharp instrument. The sitting room, typically the most peaceful space in the Borden home, had become the site of an unthinkable act of violence. Andrew's body showed evidence of at least 10 separate blows, suggesting a frenzied and personal nature to the attack. The violence was so severe that it would have been impossible for him to survive even the first few strikes. Lizzie, appearing to be in shock, told Bridget that she had been in the barn looking for fishing equipment when she returned to find her father in this condition. She claimed to have no idea who could have done such a thing or when the attack had occurred. The front door remained locked from the inside, suggesting that whoever was responsible either had a key or was still somewhere in the house. Dr. Seabury Bowen, the family physician, was immediately summoned and arrived within minutes. After examining Andrew's body, he confirmed what was already obvious. Andrew Borden had been the victim of a brutal and deliberate attack that had occurred within the past hour. As word of the incident spread through the neighborhood, curious onlookers began to gather outside the Borden home. The idea that such violence could occur in broad daylight in one of Fall River's most respectable neighborhoods was almost impossible to accept. Andrew Borden, despite his reputation for being stern and unfriendly, was a prominent citizen whose sudden and violent death sent shockwaves through the entire community. However, the day's horrifying discoveries were far from over. As police officers began to arrive and secure the scene, someone made the decision to search the rest of the house thoroughly. What they found upstairs would prove that this was not a random crime, but something far more sinister and personal. As investigators began their search of the Borden house, they made a discovery that transformed the crime from shocking to absolutely horrifying. Upstairs in the guest bedroom, they found the body of Abby Borden, Andrew's wife and Lizzie's stepmother. Like Andrew, Abby had been the victim of multiple blows from a sharp instrument, but her injuries were even more extensive than her husband's. The positioning of Abby's body and the pattern of wounds suggested that she had been attacked while making the bed or doing some other household task. The violence directed toward her was particularly brutal, with nearly 20 separate wounds inflicted upon her head and neck. Most significantly, the condition of her body indicated that she'd been dead for approximately an hour longer than Andrew, meaning she had been attacked first, around 9:30 a.m. while her husband was out conducting business. This timeline created immediate questions about what had happened in the house during the 90 minutes between the two attacks. If there had been an intruder, why would they have remained in the house for over an hour between crimes? How could Lizzie, who claimed to have been in the house during this entire period, not have heard the violent attack on her stepmother? Police officers began interviewing Lizzie immediately, and her responses raised additional concerns. She seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just discovered two family members brutally attacked in their own home. Her account of her activities during the morning was vague and sometimes contradictory, particularly regarding her movements between the house and the barn. When asked about her relationship with her stepmother, Lizzie's answers revealed the depth of the family tensions that had been hidden from public view. She admitted that she and Abby rarely spoke and that there had been ongoing disputes about money and inheritance issues. She also revealed that Emma, her older sister, had been away visiting friends, leaving Lizzie as the only family member present during the time of both attacks. The family's domestic worker, Bridget Sullivan, was also questioned extensively. She confirmed that the household had been particularly tense in recent weeks, and that the relationships between family members had been strained. However, she had been upstairs resting during the crucial time period and could provide little information about what had actually occurred. As news of the double homicide spread throughout Fall River and beyond, public fascination with the case began to build. The Fall River police investigation into the Borden case quickly focused on the household members, as evidence increasingly pointed to the crimes being committed by someone with intimate knowledge of the family's routines and access to the house. The brutal nature of the attacks, combined with the lack of evidence of forced entry or robbery, suggested a deeply personal motive. Investigators discovered several troubling inconsistencies in Lizzie's account of the morning's events. She claimed to have been in the barn loft, looking for fishing equipment, but officers found no evidence that the dusty loft had been recently disturbed. Her description of her activities during the crucial 90-minute period between the two attacks continued to change with each interview. The investigation also revealed the extent of the family's financial disputes and personal animosities. Neighbors testified about the cold relationship between Lizzie and her stepmother, and several people recalled recent arguments between Lizzie and her father about money and her future independence. The inheritance issues that had been causing tension for years suddenly appeared in a more sinister light. One particularly damaging piece of evidence emerged when investigators learned that Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid, a form of cyanide, from a local Auwis pharmacy just days before the attacks. The pharmacist had refused the sale because Lizzie could not provide a valid reason for needing the poison, but the attempt suggested premeditation and a willingness to harm others. On August 11th, 1892, exactly 1 week after the discovery of the bodies, Lizzie Andrew Borden was formally arrested and charged with the murder of her father and stepmother. The arrest of a respectable spinster from a prominent family sent shockwaves through Fall River society and captured the attention of newspapers across the nation. The arrest also highlighted the unprecedented nature of the case. Women were rarely accused of violent crimes in Victorian America, particularly women from upper-class families. The idea that someone like Lizzie, a Sunday school teacher and church member known for her charitable work, could commit such brutal acts challenged societal assumptions about feminine nature and capability. As Lizzie was taken into custody, she maintained her innocence with a composure that impressed some observers and disturbed others. Her calm demeanor in the face of such serious charges would become a central element of public fascination with the case and would continue to fuel debates about her guilt or innocence for generations to come. The trial of Lizzie Borden began on June 5th, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and immediately became one of the most closely followed legal proceedings in American history. Newspapers across the country sent reporters to cover every detail, and public interest in the case reached fever pitch as Americans grappled with the possibility that a respectable woman could commit such horrific crimes. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, built their case on circumstantial evidence and the inconsistencies in Lizzie's statements. They argued that she had both motive, the inheritance disputes and family tensions, and opportunity, being the only family member present during both attacks. They also presented evidence of her attempt to purchase poison and her calm demeanor following the discovery of the bodies. However, the prosecution faced significant challenges. They had no murder weapon, despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding area. The timeline they proposed required Lizzie to have committed both crimes, cleaned herself of blood evidence, and disposed of the weapon all within a very narrow time frame. Most importantly, they could not explain how a woman of Lizzie's size and physical capabilities could have inflicted such devastating injuries. The defense, led by former Massachusetts Governor George Robinson, focused on the lack of physical evidence and the improbability of Lizzie committing such violent acts. They portrayed her as a devout Christian woman who had dedicated her life to charitable works and was incapable of such brutality. They also highlighted the sloppy police investigation and the contamination of evidence that had occurred in the immediate aftermath of the crimes. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when the prosecution attempted to introduce evidence of Lizzie's attempt to purchase poison. The defense successfully argued that this evidence was prejudicial and irrelevant to the specific charges. The judge ruled it inadmissible. This decision eliminated one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence suggesting premeditation. The trial also featured testimony from Bridget Sullivan, who had been the prosecution's key witness. However, under cross-examination, she admitted that she had not actually witnessed anything directly related to the crimes and could only testify about the general atmosphere in the household. Throughout the proceedings, Lizzie maintained her composure and dignity, appearing in court each day dressed in fashionable black clothing that emphasized her respectability. She never testified in her own defense, which was her legal right, but her silent presence became a powerful element of the defense strategy. On June 20th, 1893, after deliberating for just over an hour, the all-male jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Lizzie Borden walked free, legally vindicated, but forever marked by the shadow of suspicion that would follow her for the rest of her life. The quick acquittal reflected several factors that worked in Lizzie's favor. Victorian society found it nearly impossible to believe that a respectable woman could commit such violent crimes. The prosecution's case, while compelling in its circumstantial aspects, lacked the definitive physical evidence that would have been necessary to convince a jury to send a Sunday school teacher to the electric chair. However, Lizzie's legal victory came at an enormous personal cost. Despite her acquittal, much of Fall River society continued to view her with suspicion and fear. Former friends and church associates distanced themselves from her, and she found herself increasingly isolated in the community where she had lived her entire life. Within a few months of her acquittal, Lizzie used her inheritance to purchase a large house in Fall River's most fashionable neighborhood. She adopted the name Lisbeth and attempted to live the independent, cultured life she had always desired. She traveled, entertained guests, and pursued interests in theater and music that had been discouraged during her restrictive upbringing. Emma, her older sister, initially stood by her during and after the trial, but their relationship gradually deteriorated. In 1905, Emma moved out of their shared home following a dispute, and the sisters never reconciled. Emma later told friends that she could no longer live with Lizzie, though she never publicly stated her reasons. Lizzie lived the remaining 34 years of her life in Fall River, becoming an increasingly reclusive figure who was pointed out to visitors as the woman who got away with murder. She died on June 1st, 1927, at the age of 66, taking whatever secrets she possessed to her grave. The case of Lizzie Borden continues to fascinate people more than 130 years later because it represents the perfect unsolved mystery. The evidence suggests guilt, but not definitively. The social conventions of the era make the crime seem impossible, yet someone clearly committed these brutal acts. That studio portrait from 1892, showing a composed and respectable Victorian woman, remains one of the most haunting images in American criminal history. A reminder that the most ordinary faces can hide the most extraordinary secrets.